So now let's say that you have actually taken a photo in the raw file type with your camera. And one of the things that you want to do is to be able to process it. So before, up until this point, I always talked about, using some software to process, let's see, I'm trying to find a specific one. Using some software to process the raw files. And so this is actually what I am talking about, is using Photoshop. What is going on with this thing? Okay, oh, are you serious? Now what? Okay, I'm going to try one more time. And I know this one works because this is from my ancient 5-year-old 20D. So once this loads up, then hopefully we will see. Okay, so now I've taken a photo in the raw format with my camera. I have opened up Photoshop and I have dragged that photo into Photoshop, or I've tried to open it up. And so one of the things that happens first when you have a raw file, now notice that this same screen will not appear if you just open up a JPEG with Photoshop. Anything that is not a raw file format will not open up with this window. This only opens up because it is a raw file format. Now we have a variety of things that we can manipulate in this image. And I'd always talked about using software to process a raw image, and this is sort of the beginning steps of what I am talking about. At the simplest, to process a raw file, you open it up in software like Photoshop, and then you just leave everything alone. You don't touch any of these messy sliders or anything like that. Just click Open Image, and after a few seconds, what you will get, unless you have my really slow computer, and it's a few minutes, what you will get is a file that has been converted from the raw file type into a more friendly file type. So this here, where I can then manipulate it in Photoshop or just save it as a particular JPEG. So actually, if you will allow me, I'm going to do one thing to make this easier so I don't have to keep switching things back and forth. Now doing this at its simplest, where you're just opening a raw file and you are processing it and then you are saving it as a JPEG, this is very easy to do because it only takes a couple of clicks, but I argue that this is sort of counter to the point of the raw file type, because what you are not doing is you're not using that raw file to the degree that you are allowed to. So I'm not saying that you have to always manipulate an image, but if you find yourself doing this more often than not, and what I mean by this is opening a raw file and just processing it as with all the default options, you might as well just take photos in JPEG. There's really not a reason for you to use RAW unless you're going to be doing some sort of manipulation with them. Okay, so with that out of the way, what I'm going to do is close this and try reopening it. 4199, drag this back here. And after a few minutes, I get this window back. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today, at least in this first half, was some of these options that are available to us here. So you can do a lot of things in this camera raw, essentially this add-on that exists in Photoshop. And so some of the most obvious things are over here on the right side. So for example, you can adjust the color temperature. So let's say that the color is slightly askew. So for whatever reason, let's say, oh, I don't remember this sunset actually being red. Maybe I want it to be a little bit cooler. Then you could adjust the temperature as necessary. Now, of course, you can do a lot of these modifications to JPEG files as well, but you will find that with RAW files, you will be able to do these conversions at the highest quality and also more easily than you could in JPEG format. So, because essentially what you're doing is you're using the data, the raw data, that as it comes off of the camera's sensor. It saves it into this very large file. You're opening it in Photoshop and you're able to manipulate that raw data as it exists. Now, one of the things that you'll notice before I delve even deeper into it is that we have a histogram in the upper right-hand corner showing us basically the histogram of this particular image. Now, okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way to tie it into the lecture that we had last week. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that a lot of these raw processors has is preset white balance settings. So you can change it from the default, the as shot, which is what the camera decided the white balance would be. Don't worry, we'll talk about more about what white balance is at a later point in time when it gets to the color lecture. Or you could try to have Photoshop pick a white balance automatically, or you can use one of these presets to try to pick the appropriate color temperature. And this may or may not be appropriate based on the particular type of image that you have. Now, one of the interesting things about almost all white balance, or rather all raw processors, is the ability to pick a color in the image and use that as sort of the white balance. So you could say that, so as you can see, I've clicked on this eyedropper tool in the upper left-hand corner, this white balance tool as it's called, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see this one up here. And what this lets me do is I can select a particular point in the image that's either white or very close to it, or maybe some form of gray, to be able to pick the correct color balance. And that's going to be difficult in this particular image. There's not a lot of strictly white portions of the image. But just to give you an example of what sort of drastic changes we can do, I'll try to click on this red portion of the light over here. You can see that now it's trying to compensate for that by making it very, very blue and actually kind of ugly. All right, but changing it back to a somewhat more normal white balance. All right, now the other great thing about using the RAW format is that the camera stores a lot more data in the RAW file than you actually see. So this file that we see, or this image that we see right here, there's a certain amount of data to it, but there's actually more data stored inside of the RAW file that allows us to manipulate certain things that we might have messed up before, such as the exposure. So let's say that you are pretty bad at taking a properly exposed shot. Well, you could use this exposure slider to try to correct the exposure. Now, one of the nice things about this is that you can actually recover quite a few details back from the image while using this exposure slider, even if it's slightly, and I mean slightly, overexposed. I've been talking a lot about if you overexpose something, that's it. You can't recover that data. That was somewhat of a lie, because with RAW, you can recover some amount of data, but I really wasn't kidding. There's a certain point where there's just no more data, and there's just nothing that you're going to do. By pulling this exposure slider back, if you really have overexposed some particular image, you're just going to make that patch of overexposure darker. You're not actually going to be recovering data. But we do get some additional latitude here. So one of the things that was noticeable to me, and I'll zoom in just a little bit to try to make it more apparent for you, was in this section of clouds up here. So when I had the exposure set to about the default, so at about 0 in terms of the relative number of stops from the exposure as it was, you can see that there's some details that are potentially missing from the clouds. But if I try to pull it down, then we sort of recover some of the details, particularly these little wisps of clouds that are off to the side that just were not particularly visible before. Now, this doesn't mean that you should always use this slider, because obviously I've now made this particular image horribly underexposed, but the option is there using this slider. So sometimes you might get some other, all right, let's try default. So you might get some other sliders as well, depending on the RAW processor that you're using. Sometimes you'll get something that Photoshop calls recovery. But if we click on this, one of the things you'll notice is that what this is doing is, well, it might be tough to tell in this particular image, but almost all RAW processors have a similar thing where it tries to bring overexposed regions down to a better exposure level. So if you have certain regions of the photo that are slightly overexposed and you need to try to recover details in them, you can use this recovery slider to try to regain those details that you might have lost. And again, if you're using other RAW processors, it might be called something else. Now, fill light does sort of the opposite. That is, if you have lost details in the darker regions of your photo, you can try to use something like this fill light to try to bring in additional light into those darker regions. And you'll notice that, did it actually make a difference? It looks different on my screen here, but. All right, so now I've been able to recover actually some, you can see some power line posts, some mountains, and other nouns that I apparently can't think of right now. So anyway, you can use this, and of course, when I'm showing you these things, I mean you should use them in moderation. You should not be using these sliders to the extreme that I'm showing you. That usually indicates that you just didn't take the photo very well to begin with, or that if it really needs something with that much modification, you might need to go back and try to reshoot it. But it does allow you a little bit of latitude so that you can try to recover a little bit of details and try to get quite a bit of information back. Was there a question? Yes. I'm sorry, can you speak up just a tad?
Sometimes when I need the recovery or the fill light, I can put ghosting in the image.
So yes, so the reason that you get these sort of artifacts around the regions that have been enhanced using these sliders, so using recovery to bring down highlights or fill light to bring up some dark regions, you might get some weird halo-like effects around the regions that have been most greatly affected by it. And that has to do with basically what's called the tone curve of the image. And basically what we're doing when we're modifying these sliders is that we're changing something called the tone curve of the image to alter how it appears to us. And so I don't want to go into too much about this because we will, of course, at a later point in time. But basically by somehow manipulating this tone curve, if I can manipulate it, you will see that you can actually, all right, so let's say that I've adjusted this highlight slider under the tone curve section. So I clicked on tone curve here and just adjusted the highlights. You'll notice that whereas before the tone curve was this sort of straight line, which is misleading because the tone curve is actually not a straight line, we've now introduced this sort of additional bump in there. That means essentially that we are over-representing the brightness of some pixels relative to other pixels. And so we can get weird effects because we're essentially, you can think of it as kind of stretching the brightness of a particular range of images. And so you can get some weird effects within that region that's overly stretched. And so without going into a large discussion about what the tone curve is and talking about it for an hour, that's really sort of the best answer I can give for right now. And so I'll have to, I guess, defer a better answer to when we actually talk more about this at a later point in time. Okay, so going back to these sliders, one of the things that you can do, so I mentioned how you can fix some of the problems in your image, but sometimes you might have taken a pretty good image and all you really want to do is to just somehow make it a bit better. So rather than manipulate the recovery or the fill light, and it's unfortunate because this projector over-saturates and makes everything a little bit more contrasty than it appears otherwise. One of the things that we might want to do is actually to increase the contrast so that we can get maybe a little bit more punch into that image. Another thing we might do is actually increase the saturation, no, not too much, increase the saturation and get just a little bit more color into it as well. And so rest assured that this is starting to look cartoonish in colors on the screen, but on this computer it looks starting to look fantastic. So I'm doing this for myself, not for you, right? Okay, so now I can even increase the vibrance, which is related to the saturation, but it seems to increase local contrasts, perhaps. So this is difficult to quantify, but really you can increase these sliders and try to get the exact amount of punch that you want to get in a particular image. Now, one of the things that I do want to point out is, oh no, that's not what I wanted to point out, is this information that exists at the bottom of this camera raw window. So you'll see that at the very bottom, underneath the image name, it gives me some information. It says Adobe RGB, 16-bit, and then the size. So it's an 8 megapixel image at 240 pixels per inch. And so I should mention that the pixels per inch doesn't really impact how this image will appear on your screen. Modifying the pixels per inch really only matters when you're going to print your image. And generally you want somewhat high pixels per inch for a print that's going to be where you're going to view up close, so maybe like a 4:6 image or a 5:7, for example. But if you're going to be printing it on something much larger that's to be viewed farther away, like on a billboard, for example, then you could get away with a much lower pixels per inch. But I'm just mentioning this because I think sometimes there's a bit of confusion about exactly what this can do. Don't worry about it if you're not going to be modifying this, or if you're not going to be printing this information, or this photo rather. So if I click on this, this little bit of text that exists at the bottom, I can actually modify this particular image. And so you remember now when I was telling you that every color channel has in a JPEG file 8 bits of information, or 256 different values available to it. Now that gave us quite a bit of values, of different color values within one particular image. However, that's not always good enough, especially when we're about to modify an image. So if you're going to do a lot of modification to an image, I recommend that you don't use 8 bits per channel, but instead use 16 bits per channel. So if you're about to do further modifications to this in Photoshop beyond what you're doing in Camera Raw, then you might want to use 16 bits per channel. On the other hand, if you're just going to open the image as it is, save it as a JPEG, then you might as well just make this an 8-bit per channel image. If you're in doubt, just always use 16 bits per channel, and then when you save it as a JPEG, it will be downsampled to 8 bits, to the amount that we have discussed up until this point. And from here, you can also decrease the size of the image as well. So Photoshop gives us some pretty easy ways of making the image smaller, or for whatever reason, making it a lot bigger, which, as you know, is just going to be a digital zoom of sorts, and we won't actually get any additional information. It's just going to be bigger. All right, now Adobe RGB, I'm going to argue you shouldn't actually use. You should pretty much always use sRGB. Keep that in mind because that'll be a question later. All right, then we'll just open this image. And so that's really how we can process this raw file, sort of in a nutshell. Now, one of the other things that can happen to you, so if you're to run into this situation where you try to open a new photo in Photoshop and you get this error, cannot complete your request because Photoshop does not recognize this type of file, this usually means that you're going to be stuck with the first-party software that comes with your camera for a little while. So just because I get this message, it doesn't mean that I can't do anything with these raw photos. I can actually use the software that came with the camera. In this case, it depends on which type of camera you have, but if you have a Canon, then it's going to be called Digital Photo Professional, and if you have a Nikon, it's called something NX or FX or something. I have no idea. But anyway, I forget exactly. So you can use that software to open it up, but one of the other things about using this first-party software is that you can also usually connect to the camera directly and be able to get sort of a live view of what's going on. And I apologize that this looks absolutely terrible, but I blame it on this crappy pane of glass that exists over here that I'm pointing the camera through right now. Otherwise, if I were to point it at, say, the very fancy clock that we have up here, let's see, is this going to, I have to do this. All right, let's see. Here's the clock. All right, that's a bit better. Now you can watch your lives ticking away as I blab about this. Okay, so now you're saying, oh, it's almost time for the 5-minute break. But really what this allows you to do is you can have a live view of the image that you are about to take. And this is particularly useful for studio setup. So if you're going to take some product shots, or if you're going to take some shots in your home, you can connect the camera using a USB cable to your computer and try to get this sort of live view of a particular image. You can usually control the camera directly from your computer, so I can try test shooting. Nope. All right, so it just took you might have just heard a small click, and so it's just taking a image, if it's ever going to show up. So that's the downside to having a new camera, is that it has too many megapixels, and then it makes your computer slow, and you get this fancy spinning pinwheel of death. All right, so we have immortalized the time. Is that right? Oh yeah, it is. Okay, 6:22 p.m. All right, now I'm just showing you this because these tools do exist, not only in first party, but also to a degree in third party as well, where you can connect it and be able to use Lightroom or Aperture or I believe there's some software called Capture One where you can connect to the camera and be able to modify the settings. And in fact, you can see all of the settings that are available here. I'm running an aperture of f4.5 with an ISO of 100. And it's going to take a photo in the RAW format. And I have an exposure compensation of about +1/3 stop, or I could actually modify that in my particular camera. And also because not +5. Oh man. Oh no, not -5. All right, well, all right, you're getting the idea. And all of this live view is making the battery go completely to waste, so I will close this. All right, now the point of this, again, is just to show you that if you were taking photos indoors or somewhere where you have a controlled amount of light, then this can be a very, very good way of being able to preview the photos that you are about to take. Another really good way, if you perhaps don't have a computer where you can move it to where you're about to take the photos, for example, maybe you're taking photos in your living room, for example, and you have a TV there. Many times you can connect the camera to a TV instead and be able to get a view of the images as you shoot them, or even this sort of live view where you can actually see the images as you're about to take them there as well. Okay, now let's see. So all of this software is really meant to be able to capture these photos, manipulate them some way, and then be able to publish them on the internet or print them out or do any sort of manipulation like that. So if I have an image, and I'm going to have to, I guess I'll open this one instead, 4189. Oh, come on. No, you know what? I'll do 74. So now let's say that you have taken an image, and one of the things that you notice is that you kind of like the image, but there's something really annoying like a power line that runs through it or some other problem that exists with it. You might realize that this is what Photoshop is designed to do. It's designed to help you try to eliminate problems such as that. So if we just process this image, one of the things that we might want to do is somehow manipulate this image. And one of the most obvious ways we can do it is to actually is to remove that power line somehow. But perhaps one of the less obvious ways that we can do it is to modify some of this this data or some of this information that we could have modified in Camera Raw, but we will use another tool instead, and that is to use, let's say, levels or curves. And so I'm showing you these tools because you can use these to manipulate quite a bit of information in the photograph and change how it appears quite a drastic amount. And so using levels, you will see a histogram for your particular image. And you can see that we get to pick which channel we want to modify the levels for. In this case, I want to modify all three channels, red, green, and blue. And I have some sliders underneath where if I change the sliders somehow, you can see that it's making some sort of modification to that particular image. So really quickly, just to introduce this levels tool to you, when you see this, this histogram, you should know that it's representative of the photo itself. Now, you might remember that this far left section represents the shadows region, so how much of this region is actually really quite dark. The opposite end is how much is really quite bright. But you might also realize that there's a bit of a gap between the absolute dark region and where the bulk of our dark pixels actually are. What we can do is modify this histogram to try to make all of those pixels actually black. So now if you notice, if you pay attention in particular to, I guess, well, if you look everywhere in the photo, as I modify this slider, you see that things seem to be getting a little bit darker. But what is actually happening is that you are making this point. So what used to be this area right here in the histogram, by sliding this black point slider over, you're making this the new black, so to speak. You're making it the value 0 in the end result. So this, which used to be this value 32 right here, is now a value 0. So you can imagine that now what you are doing is something that used to be actually quite light, and again I apologize for the over contrastiness of this particular projector, but something that actually used to be quite light, where you can actually see the details on this particular mountain, including the lack of flora that actually exists in this desert mountain. You can actually make it a silhouette proper by moving this black slider over and allowing that particular portion of the image to become a true black within the particular image. Now likewise, I could do the same thing on this end to manipulate what represents white. So right here I do have a bit of a spike representing some overexposed pixels, which are most likely the very top area of pixels where there's some sunlight sort of peeping through the clouds. But if I want to try to make that region a little bit brighter, I can move this over as well, which allows more pixels to become white. So rather than these pixels being slightly less than white, they were just ever so slightly darker than white, we are now, by moving the slider over, making them white. So what that means is that we have essentially increased the contrast in this particular image, but we have done it in such a way that we get to define exactly what is black and exactly what is white. So you have a finer grained control over modifying the contrast using a tool like this levels tool, rather than just using a sort of dumb slider where you can just increase the contrast and you just have to eyeball it. Rather than here, you actually get to define this as being a silhouette and the very top region as being this white area. And so with this in mind, you can modify these other sliders. Just realize that what you were doing is saying that, okay, these pixels that used to be a middle gray, used to be a value of 114, if I slide them upwards, then what is going to happen is that, okay, now these pixels that used to be brighter over here are now this new middle gray. So it makes the whole thing appear to be darker, if that makes sense. So we are modifying the contrast quite a bit. So before we had this sort of image, which was kind of neat, but it didn't show the texture in the clouds, and you could see too much texture in this mountain. Now we can actually exaggerate the texture in the clouds and just make the mountain a particular silhouette. And when we click OK, then we would be able to modify those particular pixels. Now the downside, of course, is that we get this obnoxious power line to be even more obnoxious. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about Photoshop.